Well, good morning. I'm Mike Gerhardt. I'm the scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center. It's a great privilege for me to be able to do that. I normally teach at constitutional law at UNC Chapel Hill, which is not that far, at least by airplane. And it's terrific to be here today with Mary Bilder to talk about her terrific new book, which is called Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention. So I'm going to talk to Mary for roughly an hour, but you'll also have the chance to write down questions. There'll be people coming through giving you the chance to sort of jot down some questions on index cards. Just as a little bit of background, Mary is a professor of law and distinguished scholar at Boston. Yes. Sorry, it's also mic'd, which hopefully is going to carry throughout the room. But we are here today with Mary Sarah Bilder, whose terrific new book is Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention. Mary is a professor of law and distinguished scholar at Boston College Law School, where she teaches property, trusts, and estates, and American legal and constitutional history. And in case you missed it, I am Mike Gerhardt, scholar in residence here at the NCC and also constitutional law professor at UNC. But back to Mary, which is much more important. Mary is also, has also been a visiting professor at both Columbia and Harvard Law School, and she's a member of a number of distinguished places, including the American Law Institute, and a fellow of the American Bar Foundation. And her 2004 book, The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture in the Empire, was awarded the Littleton Griswold Award from the American Historical Association. I expect great things for the next book, which we're going to talk about now as well, which is a remarkable study of Madison's relationship with his notes. Now, that may seem a little dull, but I can tell you it's not.
Hopefully
because they are one of the primary ways we understand the American Constitution. And maybe one of the best places to begin, Mary, is just tell us, why do people think of Madison as the father of the Constitution?
So James Madison outlived everybody else. And if you live the longest, you get the last word. The historian Drew McCoy called him last of the fathers in another wonderful book on Madison. And by the time he died when he was 85 years old. And as he got older, he actually started to keep track of who was left from the convention. Young men used to come and visit him and ask him about the convention. And or they'd ask him, could you publish your notes? And he said, well, I don't know, let me think about it. And people would write him, we think you're the last one. And he's like, no, this person's still there, this person's still alive. And so by the end of his life, he really was the only remaining person who had participated in the Philadelphia Convention that wrote the Constitution. And because of that, sort of outliving everybody, he got to be the most important. And also, he left this remarkable set of notes. It's the only sustained account of what happened at the convention that wrote the Constitution. So he's sort of doubly important.
Yes, and so Madison's a very competitive fellow, as we're going to discover in a minute, and it turns out to be quite a constitutionally significant way. So how does it come about that he was taking those notes?
So let me backtrack because people might think like notes, whatever. The notes are held by the Library of Congress, and they're considered a top treasure of the American people. They're probably one of the most important manuscripts held by the Library of Congress. And the book argues that he took those notes originally as a diary. He was particularly interested in keeping track of the proceedings for Thomas Jefferson. We tend to sometimes think that Thomas Jefferson was at Philadelphia, but he wasn't. He was in France, and he missed the whole thing. It was like a big party, and he thought the party was in Europe, but the party was back in the United States. And he actually doesn't come back until after the Constitution's ratified. So Madison, I argue in my book, took the notes for himself, but also very much so that he could share with Thomas Jefferson upon Thomas Jefferson's return or in letters what had happened that summer.
Yes, and And in fact, the notes sometimes are given an authoritative status in the construction of the United States Constitution, which of course we're going to be now looking at whether or not they either have that status, and more importantly, what that status might actually allow for or mean. How did you discover that Madison revised his notes?
So there's hundreds and hundreds of books written about the Constitutional Convention. And every single one of them tells the story that Madison tells in his notes, because it was the only version of what happened that makes it seem like an exciting drama and a play. And it's the only account we have. And when I began to write this book, I have little kids, and I thought I'd write, my first book took a lot of research, so I thought my second book I should just sit in my office, and I was going to just read the notes. And I would tell the story of Madison's version in the notes. And I became very interested in what the notes probably looked like on the day he finished writing them in 1787, because when the notes were finally published by Dolly Madison, she mentioned that they were revised. Everybody's known they were revised. And so I became kind of interested, well, what did they look like on the day he left the convention? And as I went back to try and reconstruct that, more and more mysteries began to be apparent, that the manuscript that we had taken as having been written that entire summer probably hadn't been written their entire summer. And so the book argues that Madison actually never finished his manuscript that summer, but he finished it somewhat later.
Well, in fact, if you want to think of it this way, it's almost like a detective story, because we're going to discover that the notes weren't just revised, but they may well have been revised with a very important purpose in mind. And to take us back a little bit more towards the beginning, in what capacity did Madison come to the Constitutional Convention? Yeah,
he came, Madison was in his mid-30s when he went to the Constitutional Convention, and we think of him as famous. This is the picture my publishers put on the cover. It's a very nice, it's a beautiful picture of Madison. This is what we tend to think of him as. The picture I wanted, but they were right, but I wanted the picture that's in the middle of the book. You probably can't see it, but he looks like a kid. He looks actually about 14 years old, and he wasn't. He was, this is a couple years before the convention. And I thought that was a great picture. It's actually a beautiful portrait of him. But he was he was quite young. He was in his mid-30s. He looked even younger. He actually wasn't famous yet. He wanted to be famous. He thought he was really smart. But when he showed up at the convention, there were people like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, other people who had already made their reputations. And so part of the story that I tell in the book is about a different Madison than we sometimes think we know, a Madison who's in some ways trying to figure out who is he and trying to persuade everybody to agree with what he thinks is the right new foundation for the country.
Well, he's also part of the Virginia Delegation, which you might want to tell us about, because it turns out to be a very significant delegation there at the convention.
And so Madison the Constitutional Convention was actually the second effort to write a national constitution. Madison had been very involved in an effort the previous year at Annapolis that had failed because not all the states had shown up. And the Virginians persuade Congress to authorize a second convention, the convention that we know as the Philadelphia Convention. And the Virginians were the major movers, and they get to Philadelphia early. They had decided to hold the second convention in Philadelphia because that meant that the people who they thought were the other really important players, the Pennsylvania delegation, could just roll out of their houses in the morning. They wouldn't be late. That would be a good idea. And so the Virginians put together a very important delegation. It includes Edmund Randolph and George Washington, very importantly. And they come to Philadelphia, and everybody else is late. And so because they're there ahead of time, they spend a lot of time figuring out what plan they should advance. And from the beginning of the convention, the Virginians present a plan. And I'm a lawyer, and if you do any kind of lawyering, you know that one of the most important things is to sort of get your plan as the foundation. And then everybody else is arguing against your plan. And that's really what the Virginians are able to do. And then they sit around and wait and wait and wait. And Madison's extremely aggravated that nobody else is on time for the convention. So the convention starts over a week late while they're waiting for enough other delegations to begin. And when he takes his notes his first day, he writes the date that the convention was supposed to start and then says it doesn't start till, and then on the next line he finally writes May 25th, when enough people finally showed up in town to begin. So he is part of this important Virginia delegation that writes the very first plan draft for a new constitution.
Was he the reporter, or was there a reporter for the
Yeah,
convention?
there was a reporter, William Jackson, who kept an official record of the convention, and the National Archives holds that record today, and that's the official record that was kept. But the way you were supposed to write an official record was you just wrote down the motions and the votes. You didn't write down what everybody said. No one at this time thought that you ought to have a verbatim record. And so a number of members of the convention took notes themselves during the convention. And Madison took quite extensive notes, and then he wrote his notes up twice a week, and that's the manuscript that we have today.
So he took notes during the convention, but the notes he took turned out to be not necessarily the notes we've got.
Right.
So how extensive were the notes he took during the convention, and then what did he end up doing with those notes?
Yeah, so I teach, and now when you teach, all your students basically transcribe everything. They type super fast on their computers. Madison was writing, obviously, with a quill pen, and he didn't know shorthand. And in fact, the kind of shorthand that people took wouldn't have been able to keep up with a speaker. So Madison took a set of rough notes during the convention itself, using abbreviations, and then on Wednesday night, when he wrote his correspondence, and on Sunday, he turned those notes into a more finished product. And anyone who's ever tried to figure out notes a couple days later knows that you have to do some creative interpretation. So even as Madison took the record that we now have, he was obviously figuring out what he meant. And he also knew what happened, right? He was writing only twice a week. So his notes reflect often what happened. One thing that was really fun in writing this book was once it became obvious he was writing twice a week, it solved a major mystery. People who speak on Saturdays in Madison's notes always give great speeches. And people sort of said, wow, the Saturday speeches were really great. Okay, and it wasn't that the Saturday speeches were really great. There was no convention held on Sunday, and so Madison had a whole day to write notes up just from the day before. And so it's not surprising that if you looked at the notes, the Saturday speeches are dominant.
And of course, the people giving the speeches or talking at the convention, they know Madison's taking the notes, but they don't necessarily realize that the notes he's taking will take on an iconic status.
Right, and many of them were taking notes also. In fact, we have a lot of different notes from the convention. So he wasn't the only note taker.
Well, some of the folks, in fact, talking at the convention may have turned out, if they'd known better, would have realized that somebody that didn't necessarily respect them or agree with them was going to end up with the authoritative notes. So talk a little bit about some of the couple of other folks who are speaking, but Madison's the one, in a sense, transcribing what they're doing. Hamilton and Pinckney, for example.
Right. So Madison's notes, historians and law professors and judges have tended to think that when Madison took notes, he was taking them the way that we would think a reporter would take notes. But he wasn't. He was taking them for himself and Thomas Jefferson. And so he focused on people who were either allies of the Virginians or were his arch enemies or were people who said things that he thought were interesting. And there's a lot of people who don't ever show up in Madison's notes, and who knows, they might have said things, but Madison didn't write them down. A couple people loom very large in the notes. Madison was fascinated by Alexander Hamilton, and so Alexander Hamilton, who wasn't there for the entire convention, but his speeches loomed very large. Madison was, I argue, found Charles Pinckney from South Carolina extremely annoying. Pinckney, that's the only way I can describe it. Pinckney was about Madison's age. There's these letters in the Library of Congress with Pinckney, that Pinckney wrote Madison, and Pinckney had this big handwriting. It's sort of florid. It's just huge. And after the convention, Pinckney actually writes Madison this letter that sort of says, here I am, I'm married, having a fine time. I gather you're still a bachelor, which was pretty much in your face. And Pinckney and Madison were staying at the same house together, and there's a lot of competition between them. And Pinckney actually introduces a plan also at the convention at the beginning, and Madison doesn't record it. And in fact, Madison basically leaves Pinckney out almost entirely through the beginning of his notes. And so when we read the notes, it looks like Pinckney never, ever even had a plan. Historians now believe that Pinckney had a plan. It was actually a quite interesting plan.
And so tell us about a few other plans that were sort of introduced.
Yeah, so the Virginians had a plan. The Virginians thought that the problem with the government under the document, the Articles of Confederation, that had been set up at the time of the Revolution, was that the states were too powerful. And they thought that we didn't have a great national government, and we needed a great national government to defend the country and to impress the European powers and to have the kind of economic power that the European countries would lend money to the United States. And George Washington thought it was an enormous problem. Washington's soldiers hadn't been paid for various reasons. And so the Virginians really wanted a very strong national government, very, very strong national government. And Pinckney also wanted a pretty strong national government. And there were another group of states with delegates where there were very small populations, small boundaries, what we tend to think of as the small states. And they were very worried about these plans where the large states, they felt, would dominate. And so everybody who came to the convention came trying to figure out who would actually run the national government. And the large states wanted the population to be largely determinative. They would basically run the government then. The small states very much wanted to keep the state representation that had existed under the Articles of Confederation because they then wouldn't be completely dominated by the large states.
So it turns out that Madison, of course, is not just revising his notes at the time, more or less, of the convention, but later. So tell us a little bit more about the times when Madison actually was literally revising his notes.
Yeah. So one of the really wonderful things about writing this book was eventually the Library of Congress, which is just wonderful, decided I wasn't a complete nut. For a long time, they thought I was a crazy person. But then, and they took a lot of pictures for me. I was always writing them, now can you take a picture of this? And then eventually they decided that I was not crazy, and they would let me see the manuscript, which is in a vault. The manuscript's in a big vault. And we went down into the conservator's lab, and one of the things I wanted to do was have the manuscript put on a light table so that you could see the watermarks, how the paper changes. And it was very exciting for me. It was a wonderful opportunity, and one of the really incredible things about the manuscript is the manuscript's quite small. Madison had this, he wasn't a very large person. He was about my height, and he was actually thinner than me, so he's a quite small person. And he had this tiny little handwriting. And so the manuscript itself is only about this, this big, but it's covered with revisions. And you can see the revisions. The Library of Congress actually has a lot of images up on its website of the revisions, and there's pictures in the book. And the book argues that Madison finished the manuscript about 2/3 of the way through until August, and then he got sick and he started to serve on committees and he never finished the manuscript. And then 2 years later, when Thomas Jefferson is returning to the United States, Madison had promised Jefferson that Jefferson could read the manuscript of the convention, but it's not finished. So Madison has to try and finish it, and he secretly borrows from George Washington the official journal, which nobody was supposed to see, and he makes a secret copy of the journal. And then he uses that secret copy of the journal to finish his notes. But you can imagine 2 years after you've taken abbreviated notes, you don't have a lot of idea what they mean any longer. And so the end of Madison's notes bear a marked resemblance to the official journal. And Madison then, as he was fitting everything in from the official journal, he realized he hadn't written down any of the important motions or things in the beginning of his notes because he was just interested in what he and his archenemies and his friends were saying. And so he went back and he rewrote the beginning by adding in all the little white spaces extra little notes. And then he started running out of space, so he pasted little pieces on top of them all. And then he presents that to Thomas Jefferson. And I think Thomas Jefferson never read all of it. That's just my own guess. What Thomas Jefferson did was he immediately turned to the part involving Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton had given this big speech where he argued maybe the United States should have an elective, basically like an elective monarch, a person who would live forever. He was trying to make the Virginians look moderate. And Thomas Jefferson flips to that part and he said, there were people who were trying to create a monarchy. And from that moment on, Jefferson's convinced that Alexander Hamilton is an enormous danger to the United States and that he's secretly trying to have a monarchy. And Madison started thinking, gosh, there's things that I wrote in the notes. I gave some speeches where I sounded suspiciously like all these things that Jefferson thinks are a bad idea. And so my book argues that Madison took those pages and he took his speeches and he rewrote those pages, leaving out the dangerous conclusion that he had made so that Thomas Jefferson would not realize that he had been more with the Hamilton crowd than Jefferson thought was advisable when he came back. And Madison and Jefferson become very, very close when Jefferson comes back.
And it turns out the revisions, and this may be a little bit of an overstatement, the revisions are not just occurring well after the end of the convention, but they tend to sort of happen in a couple of different areas. And I want to zero in on a couple of the areas in which the revisions are being made. The first one of which is what we call federalism, the relationship between the national government and the states. So tell us a little bit about those changes.
So Madison went to the convention. We would think of him as a nationalist. He wanted enormous power in the national government. He wanted to make sure the states did not get to vote as a state. And so he wanted in both the Senate and the House of Representatives the states to be given votes based on population. So his idea for the government would have been that the states have no representation as states in the national government. The small states kept counting votes, and they realized that the Virginians would win under any version of this. Virginia is just way bigger than we remember. It included West Virginia, which of course was separated at the time of the Civil War. It also included Kentucky. So Virginia is enormous, and every time they run the vote count, Virginia has all these delegates. And they worry about the power of Virginia, in part just because of that power, but in part because Virginia's interests were not seen as the same on important issues with a number of states. Probably the most significant one is slavery. Virginia held the largest number of enslaved people at the time of the convention, and in the North, states like Massachusetts had already abolished slavery, and other states were moving to abolish it. And so that line about the future of slavery is very important. Madison wants national power, and it will protect slavery, and other people want the states to basically continue to be represented.
So let's talk about slavery a little more. Turns out that maybe Madison's positions on slavery were not, let's call them enlightened, or what we might think of as modern. It might even surprise some of the folks here to discover what Madison's positions were.
Yeah, Madison's been interesting. Madison of the framers is been largely not focused on with respect to his position on slavery. This is curious. People may know George Washington held a huge number of people enslaved, but freed them at his death and at his wife's death. Thomas Jefferson didn't free anybody except the people that Sally Hemings's children. Madison freed no one. Madison was the son of a plantation owner. The plantation held about 100 people enslaved. At his death, Madison frees no one, and in fact, his secretary was so shocked by that that he thought maybe the will was a forgery. But in some respects, Madison had a very deep ambivalence about slavery. He understood that slavery violated the principles of the Revolution. He says that on a number of occasions. But he could not imagine a world where slavery didn't exist, and he couldn't imagine a world where African Americans were free. And in fact, the profits that he thought would be made from the sale of the notes were going to be given to the American Colonization Society, which Madison had supported. The American Colonization Society thought the way to solve the problem of slavery was African Americans would be freed and then sent to Africa. And Liberia is founded out of the American Colonization Society's efforts. So Madison was very comfortable with slavery, and the book argues that Madison is so comfortable with slavery that originally when he wrote the manuscript, there were no comments against slavery in the manuscript. And only 2 years later, when he goes to revise the ending for Thomas Jefferson and finish it, does he insert 2 comments suggesting that slavery was against the ideas of the founding. But that those comments were written 2 years later. They didn't reflect Madison in 1787.
Well, in fact, it's not just 2 years later, but I gather it's even after a longer delay, including after his presidency. Madison comes back and still is tinkering with the notes.
Yeah, I mean, Madison fusses with the notes his entire life. He never comes to the decision to publish them. Thomas Jefferson wanted them published in the 1790s and suggests to Madison, you should go ahead and publish them. And Madison says, well, maybe not. And Madison actually says, I think we should read them really carefully, which I think because Jefferson never read them, and figure out what people will make of them. And Madison then says, and I'm basically worried that other notes will come out, which he knew because a lot of other people had notes. And so he and Jefferson, he finally refuses to publish them. He only publishes them after his death. And then the notes become very much part of the myth that the Constitution was founded on compromise over slavery, that there were no other options available than the way that slavery is embedded in our Constitution.
Is there a way to figure out the accuracy of his revisions? That is to say, one thing that might be thought is that, well, he's revising them later just for his own sake, to sort of service his own ends. How can we say that they're servicing his ends as opposed to saying, well, he's just trying to make them more accurate? That is to say, sort of more align better with what actually happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that you could ever say, you would ever know. I think he revised them as he changed his own understanding of the Constitution. I don't think he was completely out to do something nefarious. I think mostly he was interested in the Constitution, and the convention grew in importance as time went on. In 1787, I don't believe that they realized they were writing the Constitution. In fact, I brought along, I often bring my James Madison bobblehead, but I was traveling by airplane, and TSA is convinced that the James Madison bobblehead looks highly suspicious in the luggage, so I thought I shouldn't stick it in. You'll probably get it in the gift store. But this is one of my favorite, this is a small one. So you can get the whole Constitution on a set of playing cards. I don't know, do you have these in the gift store? Probably. This is the whole Constitution on a set of playing cards. So that, the idea that they didn't have any idea in 1787 that 228 years later, the document they wrote would be on playing cards. Or here's another, this I picked up at Montpelier. This is a magic towel. it's a joke because this little thing, if you put it in water, it reconstitutes itself. Yeah. So I was like, that's irresistible. And it's got James Madison's face on it. And so the idea that in the summer of 1787, they knew they were writing the Constitution, they had no idea about that. And in fact, Madison left the convention thinking that the Constitution might not get through Congress, never mind being ratified. So only over time, slowly, does it become apparent that what they did that summer was enormously important. And Madison then gradually begins to realize that he participated in something really important. And not only that, but he has these complete notes. One thing that I think we often don't realize is that the day that they're celebrating today, the Bill of Rights Day, is really a very important part of that story. Madison is singularly responsible for the Bill of Rights. He gets elected on a campaign promise that he will push through the amendments that include what we know today as the Bill of Rights. And I always think he's one of the few American politicians who fulfills his campaign promise because he gets to the first Congress.
That's a pretty big promise.
It's a pretty good promise. And he gets to the first Congress, and everybody tells him, we don't need to do that. We don't need to get those amendments done. The Constitution wasn't conditioned on those amendments. We need to do more important things, set the government up, get the judiciary started. And Madison annoys everybody by saying, no, we need to amend the Constitution. And so that whole first summer, he pushes to have the Constitution amendment. Well, when Madison wanted to amend the Constitution, he wanted the rights to be interwoven into the original document. That is, he thought the way you ought to do it is that you would look at the Constitution and you would actually revise it. You would cross out the parts that you didn't agree with now and you would put the new language in. And when he proposed the amendments, he told everybody which parts they were going to be. Roger Sherman stands up and says, I think that's a terrible idea. He says, it will be confusing to people. So they bicker back and forth, and Roger Sherman wins. And Roger Sherman persuades everyone that the way they will amend the Constitution is the way that we assume you amend it. They will leave the text of what was written in 1787 intact, but the amendments will then be just listed at the end. And that's the way we see the Constitution today. I believe until they did that, it wasn't obvious that what happened in 1787 would be so important. Because if we had continued to amend the Constitution by writing the text in, what people had done in 1787 versus what had changed later wouldn't be so obvious. So partly it's the amending with the Bill of Rights that makes the Constitution loom so importantly.
Well, how different are the notes near the end of his life than how they looked at the time he was taking them?
Yeah, as he got older and older, he realized that words had changed. So one of my favorites is the very first day of the notes. He says, the very first day, he says, we're in Philadelphia, and he says, because we're going to revise the federal Constitution. And because he thought the Articles of Confederation was a constitution, and he was going to revise the federal Constitution. Well, once you call the thing on this playing card, right, the Constitution, you can't say Constitution with respect to the old word. So he crosses out Constitution because that's now become confusing, and he puts in system of government. And that's a very late change. We can date that change. And so Madison then makes his notes read as if there was a system of government and then there was a constitution. And that's why we call this the National Constitution Center. We don't call it the National Second Constitution Center or something confusing like that, because Madison now realizes that 1787 was this radical break in American history. And so he makes a number of those changes. One of the things that haunts him at the end of his life was the Virginians, who were in an extremely bad mood in the middle of July, voted for a president without tenure. So the idea was you would elect the president, and then the president would serve until he was impeached. And you know, figure how you'd like that, okay? It depends probably who your president is. But, and the Virginians voted for that. So that's kind of a thing that you don't really love on the record, but he couldn't change it because he knew there was a vote count out there. So he starts writing explanations that this was just a procedural thing. And then he actually replaces that page. Then he writes an explanation, the footnote. Then as he gets older, he writes another explanation. Then he writes an explanation of the margin. And then at the point where his handwriting was so shaky as an elderly man that he couldn't write himself, he has his wife's brother add another explanation to the explanation. And so that page, out of all the pages, is just literally, it curves around like this with explanation upon explanation, that they didn't really want a king, but it just seemed at the time to be a good idea.
Well, and Madison isn't, I guess, what we might think of as a good loser.
Yeah, he's not a good loser.
So what are some of the things he lost on, and what are some of the things he, in a sense, was vindicated on, or he won on?
Yeah, he thought the Senate, the way we have it conceived today, was a disaster. I mean, he left, he wrote, he was so sad that the states had equal representation. It just devastated him. He thought that a state was an incoherent concept, and he thought it was a terrible idea, and he really thought it was a terrible idea. And even after it had repeatedly lost, he thought it was a terrible idea. And everybody, he actually records in his notes, the Connecticut delegation, which had been counting and was pretty sure the Senate would end up representing the states, said, don't push this too far. And Madison kept saying, I don't care, I'm pushing this really far. So he was devastated by the state's equal suffrage. He very much comes around to that. He decides that the current federal system isn't such a bad idea. He also desperately wanted Congress to be able to veto all the laws of the states. We call that the negative. It's a concept that fell out. It was based on the British model. And he thought that if you couldn't veto all the laws of the states, then it would be hard to be a national government because the states could have whatever laws they wanted, and they wouldn't all be uniform. So he wanted Congress to be given that power. The convention actually originally agreed with him and then decided it was a bad idea. And that power today is obviously held by the Supreme Court. But Madison thought that was a disaster, that the states would be completely out of control. And he left the convention very sad that that piece wasn't formed. He was quite happy with the fact that the national government had been given power in areas where you wanted uniformity, and so he was really delighted with that. But he lost and lost. He was kind of a poor loser, and he's only 35, 36, so you have to give him a little bit of a break. But as he got older, he became very much a great supporter of the Constitution.
Given the fact that his notes are the most comprehensive, are there people, perhaps, who had a bigger role in the shaping of the Constitution than his notes reflect? I mean, who in a sense, are the losers?
Yeah, because of his notes?
Because of his notes.
Yeah. So I think there's a sort of a good person and I suppose a person complicated. The complicated person would be Charles Pinckney, who's a huge slaveholder, determined that slavery would be just completely embedded in the Constitution. His cousin, General Pinckney, only speaks to ensure that slavery lives forever. And Madison eventually scored those sections out, blacked them out so completely that you can't read them. If I ever get a second chance with the Library of Congress, they have equipment that could read those. Maybe you guys can persuade the library to use their special technology and read those. But Pinckney was given a much smaller role than he had. The person who was also given a smaller role that I think is more unfortunate is Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. Morris fascinated Madison. Morris was a fascinating figure in all sorts of respects, but he spoke passionately against slavery. He's the person who probably spoke the most passionately against slavery, and he actually, in some ways, predicts the Civil War. He says that this division between North and South, between places with in slavery and not having slavery, that is a fundamental problem. And Madison writes that speech down, but doesn't give Morris a lot of credit along the way. Late in his life, in his 80s, Madison grew more understanding of what had happened at the convention. And Madison eventually says that the person who really wrote the final Constitution was Morris. The last draft of the Constitution looks the way we understand the Constitution, with 7 major articles. But the draft before that had had 22 articles. So the Constitution didn't look anything like how we understand it. And Madison, late in his life, says it was Morris who basically took all these disparate sections and regrouped them into the way we understand the Constitution.
We also tend to think of the folks at the, the folks at the Constitution Convention as the framers. And did they have a view on whether or not the notes, or in a sense, the transcriptions of the conventions should be kept confidential or private forever or not? Did they have a consensus on that?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I completely disagree with. There's a great myth that the convention was supposed to be secret forever, and it was, they didn't allow the public in at the time. That actually wasn't unusual. When the Senate opens its doors in the new government, the Senate doesn't allow anyone to come in either. And only in the 1790s does it finally change its view that actually people should be able to hear its deliberations. So I argue in the book that no one at the time thought the convention's record should be secret forever. They just thought it should be secret that summer in order to allow people to deliberate without it being reported in the press all the time. And the notes themselves, the official record, the official journal, I think a number of people assumed would be published shortly thereafter. It becomes controversial between Madison and Jefferson and Washington about the official journal because it involves, they have disagreements about what the convention thought in terms of treaties. And so in the 1790s, in the midst of enormous fight between President Washington and Jefferson and Madison, with Hamilton and Washington on one side and Madison and Jefferson on the other, Washington takes the journal, the official journal, and he goes down and he deposits it in the State Department. And then only after it's been deposited and recorded and precisely how many pages, and that one page was loose, does Washington go and say, I have deposited the official journal safely in the government archives. And Madison writes to Jefferson, what's he doing? You know, this is crazy. But then because of that, the government owns the journal, and then the journal's eventually published. But at the time, they managed to keep it kind of quiet.
We have some excellent questions from the audience. One reason, not just substantively they're excellent, but as a law professor, I can tell you they're incredibly legible. So I want to thank all of you for that, unlike Madison's notes themselves. Yeah. So here's one. Talk about the relationship between Madison and Hamilton.
Yeah. So I know it's sort of Hamilton's revenge that he gets a musical, and Madison doesn't. You know, if you live long enough, it's good. I think at the convention they were fascinated with each other. They both were incredibly interested in the major problem that young political leaders thought was interesting. They could tell the United States was going to be a very large country, but they couldn't figure out, could you govern a large country using a republican structure? And they were both really interested in that. All of the great European thinkers since the time of Greece and Rome had said that wouldn't work, that that would not be successful, that if you made the republic very large, it would collapse. And Madison and Hamilton were both fascinated with the idea, how would you create a very, very large country using what we think of as a democracy, what they would have thought of as a republic, and have it survive? And so they were deeply, deeply fascinated with each other. Madison records things that I think had Hamilton known what he was going to do with them, he wouldn't have allowed him, but I think they were close at the convention. The minute Jefferson gets back, Madison joins Jefferson in disliking Hamilton intensely, and really becomes very swept up in Jefferson's obsession. Jefferson was just obsessed with Hamilton. And he actually, there's a great set of secret notes that Jefferson keeps where he spends all his time recording how he was trying to tell Washington how sneaky Hamilton was. And then he records Washington's responses. And you feel so bad for Washington because he's president. He's got all these people in his cabinet. And Jefferson keeps showing up. Hamilton said this, and Hamilton's like, no, I didn't say that, and they're all trying to govern the country. So they were once very close and then not so close.
Well, Hamilton, maybe it's a good thing he gets a musical because he may lose the $10 bill.
Right. Madison's not on any major coins, so he still wins again.
So here's another question from the audience. Originally, there were more amendments than 10, of course.
Yeah.
What were some of the others, and why were they not adopted?
Yeah, there's great trivia about the Constitution. So one thing that not everybody realizes is that Madison had a lot of amendments, and they're winnowed down to be 12, and they're sent out to the states as 12 amendments, which means that what we think of as our First Amendment was actually the Third Amendment. Mm-hmm. And you can figure out whether you think it would be as important if it was the Third Amendment, like, I have a Third Amendment right to speak. But that doesn't sound so good. The Third Amendment's actually quartering soldiers, so maybe the Third Amendment's a doomed space in the amendments. The first two amendments drop out. They both involved Congress. One of them's eventually re-ratified hundreds of years later as the 27th, yeah. And so we only get the 10 amendments. What's very interesting is although we think of it as the Bill of Rights, a lot of people who write on this now have shown that at the time they didn't call it the Bill of Rights. The amendments really only begin to be thought of as the Bill of Rights in the last 100 years. And so our notion that the first 10 amendments belong together is very much product of the 20th century.
So what were some of the other options on slavery that Madison left out of his notes?
Yeah, so Madison actually had, to my mind, a completely crazy idea. Slavery is embedded 5 times in the Constitution, never once using the word slave. And 2 of those involved the 3/5 compromise, the notion that people who were held enslaved would give white people from that state more political power in the ratio of 3 to 5. But Madison actually suggested that one house represent free inhabitants and one house represent basically all the population, including all the enslaved people, on a 1-to-1 ratio. And this would have not only embedded slavery just completely deeply into American government, but it would have given the Virginians power beyond anything you can imagine. The Virginians held almost 300,000 people in slavery. The entire white population of Virginia is about 450,000. So it would have really significantly altered the way that the government worked.
Well, they still, of course, dominated the presidency early on.
Right. And the Virginians, if you count who's the president, it's Washington, Virginia. Then for a brief moment, the state that I live in now, Massachusetts, gets it, with Adams. Then it goes back down to the Virginians. And if you look at studies of the early presidents and the Supreme Court and the leaders of Congress, basically a Southern slaveholder was president, I think something like 2/3 of the time, or head of the Supreme Court. So that Southern slavery bloc really does dominate early American politics.
Another great question from the audience. Do any notes by others conflict with Madison on any major issues?
Yeah, so a lot of the notes conflict with Madison's. One of the really fun things that I do when I teach this is I have people look at a different set of notes and we compare them. And other people, I personally think other people wrote more fun notes. Madison converted all, he was sort of almost like scared of emotion or something. So all of the notes he deadened the emotion, and other people's notes are often written in the first person, and they describe when people get mad. And so you can take places where people said very crazy, mad things in other people's notes, and then you can go read Madison's notes. And Madison's notes sounds like everybody's calmly debating things. So they disagree on that. They also disagree a lot about what Madison wrote about himself. So Madison wrote his own speeches. It's very hard to take notes while you're talking. For example, if I were to take notes on what I said today, first of all, I would have said only brilliant things, and they would all be completely coherent, and they would have no ums and ahs in that. And so Madison recreated his speeches after the fact, and they bear some resemblance to what other people recorded, but they are always much more coherent, very thoughtful, they follow nicely, and so his own version of himself and what others heard were quite different.
How about Edmund Randolph?
Yeah.
How about his place at the convention?
Yeah, Edmund Randolph is very close to Madison. They were very tight. Randolph and Jefferson's fathers had both died, so they had both come into possession of plantations, and Madison's father didn't die. Madison's father lives for a very, very long time, I think up till 1801. Madison's mother lives into her 90s and dies just shortly before Madison. And so Madison, he never really can grow up in an interesting way. And at some point, Jefferson actually offers to sell him land, lend him the money so he can have his own house. And Madison says, no, I don't really need that. But he and Randolph are very, very close. And Randolph is very tall. He's good looking. In the book, I argue Madison probably wanted to give the great speech introducing the plan, but everybody looks at Madison and then Randolph, and they decide Randolph's going to give the speech. And so Randolph gives the great speech. But Randolph drives Madison crazy. Randolph thought it was really bad to have a single president, and so Randolph wanted, like the Romans had, he wanted a triumvirate, and Madison thinks that's a non-starter, and he can't understand why Randolph keeps insisting on it. So over the course of the convention, they grow apart, and at the end of the convention, Randolph actually refuses to sign the Constitution, much to Madison's frustration.
And near the end of his life, I gather from your book, Madison is beginning to rethink the relevance of the notes.
Right.
So talk about that.
Right. So Randolph, very early, when Madison was redoing the notes for Jefferson, he realized that he hadn't written down Randolph's speech. So Randolph gives this great speech explaining why the Constitution needs to be written, and everybody else records it, the way you'd record the first great speech at something. And Madison writes 2 lines about it, which is, because first of all, he knew it, and secondly, I personally think he was a little annoyed that it was Randolph getting to stand up there and give the speech. And then when Jefferson's coming back, he realizes he doesn't have Randolph's speech. So he writes to Randolph, hey, can you write me your speech that you gave on the first day of the convention 2 years ago so I can put it in the notes and then it will be there? And Randolph writes back, no, I can't do that because that was 2 years ago and I would mix everything up. But Randolph sends him his notes. So Madison inserts Randolph's notes from that day in. But as he grew older, Madison became more and more persuaded that the country needed to have a record of the notes. And this is an interesting aspect. He wanted the country to have a record, but he was curiously ambivalent about the record. Madison, for somebody who was going to leave us these notes, Madison had an ambivalent reaction to posterity. And here's one of my favorite stories about Madison. People may know another useful piece of trivia, that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day. People know that? So they both died 50 years on July 4th after the Declaration of Independence. I personally think this is incredibly suspicious and don't understand why there isn't a major American motion picture about the fact that they both died on exactly the same day. It happened to be July 4th, okay?
That's your next book, by the way.
Right, it's I know, I should write that book. Anyway, 10 years later, in 1836, Madison's dying. And his family and friends, it's late June and he's dying, and they want him to live long enough so he too can die on July 4th. 10 years later, okay? So, and you can kind of see the temptation. And Dolly Madison's grandniece writes that Madison refused to take the necessary stimulants, which would have probably been opium, to allow his body to live long enough so then he could conveniently die on the same date. And instead, he died on June 28th. So you can kind of see how frustrating that was for people who cared about this. But in a way, that ambivalence about his own role, his ambivalence about posterity marked Madison's whole relationship to the convention.
Yes, and let's come back to Jefferson for a moment. What role did he have in the revising of the notes?
Yeah, I think Jefferson thought the notes would be a great political document. Jefferson read the notes, and because he was so obsessed with Hamilton, he thought that if the notes were published, it would show everyone how secretly evil Hamilton was, and it would destroy Hamilton. And Madison kept thinking, well, everybody's still alive, and then they'll know that I actually was pretty close to Hamilton at the convention, and then Jefferson will know I was close to Hamilton at the convention, and it'll be a disaster. And so Jefferson keeps pushing Madison to revise the notes and to publish them, and Madison refuses. And then throughout his life, Madison refused, and eventually Madison says, I'm just going to have them published posthumously.
So I want to also focus again a little bit on Alexander Hamilton. Not just because he's got this wonderful new musical, but because even in your talk today, and obviously as we know from constitutional history, the figure of Hamilton perhaps justifiably looms rather large. And as you say, people were obsessed with him, fascinated with him. So tell us more about Alexander Hamilton as a founder.
Yeah. One of the things that the book focuses a lot on the decade after the convention, those first years. And I think one thing that people sometimes don't understand is how close these enormous egos came to destroying the country. And maybe it was inevitable that when you get that many big brains in one room, you're going to have problems. But very quickly around Washington, on one side, Hamilton fell, and on the other side, when Jefferson returns, Jefferson and Madison, they're all in the same administration. And Hamilton was more comfortable with the British model. He thought there were problems with the British model, but he, I think, admired the nation-state status of the British government, and he thought that if you were going to be a nationalist government, you needed to have that kind of power, particularly, for example, the bank. And Jefferson thought that was a disaster, that the states should be supreme. He was dubious about national power. And he had lived in France in those years right before the French Revolution, and he was very taken by sort of that spirit of rhetoric about liberty and equality, and he worried about monarchy. And those two different visions just completely collide. And as I mentioned, poor Washington was left to deal with them all. As long as Washington was alive, everybody had enormous respect for Washington. He's one of the people who you can't find anybody who says anything negative about whatsoever. And as long as Washington was there, the system kind of held. Once Washington retired, then things really fell apart. And what's quite remarkable is that the country, I mean, it's really quite remarkable the country survives.
Yes. We have time for a couple questions. Let me let one of them be again from the audience. The question is, are you aware of any Supreme Court decisions which cite the notes that you've mentioned before in support of the decisions? That is to say, decisions of the Supreme Court that may have relied on some of the revisions that were made, let's say, later than the event itself.
Yeah, the Supreme Court's for most of its history, has been quite careful not to cite directly to the notes. They tend to cite to the Federalist Papers, which they like a lot more, which were written by Madison and Hamilton during this period when they are very close. So I don't think this book will change specific issues. I think what this book will cause some difficulty for people is that people who believe on the court in originalism may have some pause. And originalism is sometimes misunderstood. It's not the idea that you use history in constitutional interpretation. That's always been an important part of how we interpret the Constitution. But originalism is the claim that the only legitimate way to read the Constitution is what people in basically 1787 who wrote the document or the people who ratified it thereafter thought the Constitution meant, and that no other meanings are acceptable. And I think for that group of people, the sense of how difficult it was even at the moment for people to understand what the Constitution meant, how many disagreements there are at that moment, will be a little bit complicated.
Well, with time almost gone, I want to come back almost to my original question about Madison, oftentimes thought of as the father of the Constitution. Do you think after looking at those revisions and what he did in terms of trying to sort of add, change them a little bit to sort of reflect his evolving views, is it fair to think of him still as the father of the Constitution?
Yeah, I don't know that he was the father of the Constitution, but the thing I really came away from is how terribly important the document is, not as an objective record, but as a way for us to understand how difficult the task was that they faced. I came away from the whole project with enormous respect for how close the country was to falling apart and how much different people with different opinions struggled to try and hold it together, how remarkable the document was that was written in Philadelphia, but how different it looked to them than it looks to us. As I say, this is not the document they thought they were writing. The fact that they ended up on playing cards would, I think, be a great surprise to all of them.
Let me also just, and then mention a couple things about the building. We actually have a place where you'll see the life-size models of the framers. So you'll see for how short James Madison was, which may be a real victory for short people. But maybe most importantly, Mary's book is going to be on sale in the Kirby lobby outside as well. I really want to thank Mary for taking her time and sharing her expertise with us.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed being here.